Please check your message there. Okay.
Good evening and welcome to Wesley Guild SA. And it is such a great honor to be here today. Amidst all the things that are happening in the country and all the sad things that we are currently experiencing, I think it is very important to still give thanks to God. Today on this session, we will be talking about a very sensitive issue, which is tribalism in the church. Here to talk to us about it is Rev K Monoametsi from Bryanston Methodist Church, and he will be leading today's topic for us. But before we get into it, Muruti, I would like to ask you to lead us in an opening prayer.
All right, re rapeleng. Morena le modimo wa rona, ntate wa morena wa rona e leng Jesu Kriste. Modimo wa boikanyo o re ikantseng mo go yene. Kgosi e boitshepo ya kgalalelo. Wena modimo wa rona o gogileng borraetšo kwa dinageng tsa lenyora. Re atumela mo pele ga sefatlhego sa gago modimo mo letsatsing la gompieno mo rena le modimo batsedi ba rona. Thixo wethu sisondela ngexesha elinzima, sisondela ngexesha lokuphithizela Nkosi kwabantu bakho elizweni Thixo namandla amakhulu. Sisondela Nkosi apho abantu bakho bahleli ngokoyika ngenxa Nkosi yezinto sizibonayo eMzantsi Afrika. Ukulwa kwabantu Thixo wethu kwenza into ba abantu bakho babe noloyiko lokuphuma ezindlini zabo. Sisondela Nkosi kuwe ngelixesha singabantu bakho Thixo namandla amakhulu sixakene ne-COVID-19 Thixo wethu olungileyo. Siphinde sixakane Thixo wethu with the existing riots or protests in various parts of our country Thixo namandla amakhulu. Sicela kuwe menzi wezinto zonke. Ngoba Nkosi singabantu bakho unguThixo wethu. Masilawulwe Nkosi nguwe. Siphuxolo Nkosi kwelixesha. Ngakumbi abantu abasikhokhelayo Thixo namandla amakhulu. Ke thapelo ya rona gore ba fe bohlale modimo wa rona. O fele kereke ya hao lentswe, e tlebe le lentswe nakong ena modimo ya matla ohle. Mme batho ba hao modimo wa rona ba tle ba tsebe gore wena o modimo wa laola wa busa ebile wa rena ntate wa rona ya lokileng. Re rapella modimo gore o re fe kgotso modimo ya matla ohle. Re rapella ntate ya matla ohle o re fe khutso modimo ya lokileng ya galalela. Mme tsena re di kopa lebitsong le matla la morena le moloko wa rona ya kgabane jwale le ka o sa enkae. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Muruti. So as I've mentioned, today we are talking about tribalism in the church, which we have called this neglected killer of progress within our churches. Muruti will be leading the topic for us today. And if you have any comments or questions, or if you would like to take part in this conversation today, you can just leave your comment or your question on the comment section, and we will then forward it to Muruti Monoametsi, and we will engage on that. So as I had said, this is a very sensitive topic, and I think we need to approach it with the sensitivity that it has, but also quite an open mind as well. Over to you, Muruti.
Thank you very much to our Wesley Guild SA team who have hosted me today, and to members of our church who are following this channel, and any other person who is joining us this evening as we discuss and engage on this very important and yet indispensable topic in our time, particularly during this, the political unrest that we are experiencing in our country where the phenomena of tribalism has been on public discourse. It has been engaged, and people have been, in many ways, accused to perpetuate tribal tendencies during this time. And others are, of course, refuting such claims and allegations. But today we are looking at this topic from the church perspective. And in as much as we'll be looking at it from a church perspective, it is also difficult to look at it without really engaging on what are the political influences on this topic. So I will be sharing my presentation, which hopefully will really take about 30 minutes that has been allocated to me. And subsequent to that, I will open the space for engagement and for interaction. And so I have prepared a presentation with few slides. Firstly, I would like to contribute particularly to the question that a lot of people would ask. What is it that the Methodist Church of Southern Africa is doing to address tribalism? And the topic today says tribalism, a neglected killer of progress. And therefore, the implication thereof can be, is the church not doing adequately or sufficiently enough for, or rather to address this particular phenomena that has become a danger to our society, not only in the church, but to the society at large. And so I will look at what are the historical anecdotes, or rather the contributions of various scholars, both outside of the church and within the life of the church, and in many other spaces as well. What are the conceptual and the social notions of ethnicity and tribalism, and the political strategies that have been employed over centuries to entrench ethnicity and tribalism in our society? What are some of the lessons that we can learn from other African countries in dealing and responding to the challenge or the threat of tribalism in our society? And also I will look at how can we transform the misconceptions, the attitudes, the perceptions that over years we have learned as people, as communities in different cultural groups, and those have become destructive habits or destructive patterns that leads to violence. And I will look at how can we use our religious spaces, in particular the worship space, as a platform of transformation. And also, like the last one, I'll look at what are the leadership challenges that we are faced with when it comes to the issue of ethnic and tribal allegiance. And so that will be the end of my presentation. And I'm hoping that by the end of it, I would have encouraged, or rather inspire, a discussion on the subject. So when we think of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa and the struggle it has embarked on in trying to address the existing challenge or the phenomena of tribalism, and there has been, I must admit, a concoct action to confront the evil of tribalism and ethnicity within the life, the mission and the ministry of the MCSA. And that has happened in different platforms at different times. And if I may take you just a little bit backward, a few decades ago, and we find and hear that the Black Methodist consultation that met in 1985 in June, were having discussions around the same challenge to deal with the divisions within the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. And that was ranging from the racial divisions and the ethnic and tribal divisions as well. And there was a resolution that was passed at that time. The Black Methodist consultation moved that in order for the Methodist Church of Southern Africa to reflect its one and undividedness, be implemented practically, that all accepted candidates be required to learn one of the African languages and be annually assessed to monitor progress. And this was an attempt to say, if we are going to move forward as a church and try to curb some of the dividing aspects in our community, how can we do that? And language was identified as one of the key contributing factor to say if people begin to learn each other's languages, they can be in a way of trying to affirm, embrace, and be inclusive. And that reminds us of one of our leaders in the name of Seth Mukitimi, whom Dr. Kubule quote in the book that he wrote. And he says, this is what Seth Mukitimi said when he was dealing with students at that time at seminary. And he says, friendships among students and marriages of ex-Hilltown students often went across tribal language barriers. Again, language is identified here. Mukitimi himself was a brilliant linguist who fluently spoke Sesotho, which was his home language. Tswana, Xhosa, Zulu, English, and Afrikaans. Yet, in all his dealings with students, he spoke English because he did not want to be identified with any language or a tribal group. It raises the issue of sensitivity of how leaders are intentionally propagating an inclusive space. And Seth Mukitimi was a classical model of trying to be inclusive. Of course, he was using the Queen's language, but the ultimate point is that he did not want to be seen to identify with a particular group because he was aware of what the ethnic and the tribal differences can do in a community. And so for him to maintain a neutral position and to maintain a position of inclusivity and affirming people from whichever cultural background they came from, and the best for him was to use an alternative language. Again, language becomes one of the key contributing factors in dealing with this issue. In 2009, an ethnographic research was conducted by one of the scholars by the name of Elina Hankela. Now, Elina did the study with one of our Methodist churches, the Central Methodist Mission in Johannesburg. And she cites in her article when she deals with the politics of ethnicity within the Central Methodist Church. And she brings up one of the respondents or one of the people that were interviewed at that time, because this was an ethnographic research. So there were interviews that were conducted. And I want to cite what this person said at that time. This dates back as far as 2009. Hope, a congregant at the Central Methodist Mission, henceforth Central, in Johannesburg, spoke of the relationships between ethnic groups at her church, particularly from the perspective of language use, as something we need to work on. We still need, so Faith is saying, Hope, we still need to find that balance where everyone feels that they are accommodated, excuse me, despite the multilingual main service at Central and positive changes in regard to such accommodative practices. Hope perceived things to be still dominated by, in brackets, the isiXhosa language. So Hankela then says, in this article, Central provides the context to examine the politics of exclusion based on ethnicity, which play out in different contexts around the world. I agree with Hope. It is primarily the members and leaders of faith communities that need to address questions of ethnic difference and power in the faith context. The role of an academic viewpoint, such as the one explicated in this article, is to facilitate such work. So the Methodist Church and other scholars have attempted to engage this concept of ethnicity and tribalism in different spaces. And the outcomes of the research by Hankela clearly tells that there's so much work that needs to be done by the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. Moving forward, in 2014, it was brought to the attention of the Methodist people through the General Secretary report that the Methodist Church of Southern Africa is a problem of ethnicity and tribalism that needs a Christian response of all. And I quote, in the minutes of conference by the then General Secretary, the evil of racism and tribalism is rearing its insidious head and manifests itself in assorted forms and shapes within the life of the church. The tragedy is that it goes unchallenged, as it is no longer politically correct to speak about racist attitudes and tendencies. So the church has been in a space of engaging, creating a discourse where people can voice and engage with each other on the challenge of tribalism and ethnicity. And in 2015, the Black Methodist Consultation hosted a series of dialogues to engage the concerning issue of ethnicity and tribalism in the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. A report was published or given by the Black Methodist Consultation through the task team that was then assigned to look into this particular issue. And there are some tangible resolutions or recommendations that the Black Methodist Consultation resolved on, which I think they are still relevant even today. That one, the church needs to create spaces where we empower each other, engage with each other, and ensure that the Methodist Church is going to be a church for each and every member, regardless of your social background, your cultural background, and your religious understanding or position on many issues. So when we deal with tribalism and the challenge we are faced with, I look at tribalism in different perspectives. And of course, there is some work that has been done by various scholars in this particular area. And one of the theories that has been upheld in the academia by various sociologists and anthropologists are two theories, the existentialist and the constructionist. And this really helps us to understand the significance and the impact of what colonialism did to the cultural identity and the indigenous communities in our society in African continent. And so this is what Komarov said about one of the theories. He says, ethnicity is a perfectly natural phenomenon. It describes the existential self-consciousness, the shared signs and sentiments, customs and conventions of any community with culture of its own. And that theory really what it says is that existentialists believe that people were born in a tribalistic manner. They were born out of a particular tribe or ethnic group. And then you've got another theory, which mainly is informed by the constructionist understanding of tribalism. And they're saying, on the one hand, a different theory is persuaded by sociologists that ethnicity is a socially constructed phenomenon. This theory is known as constructionist. Here, they are advocating that we as people, whether you call yourself Motswana, whether you call yourself Zulu, whether you call yourself a Xhosa, we need to understand that these were colonial dimensions that were imposed upon people. Were never ever referred in that particular dimension of being known with our tribe or our ethnic groups. And one of the scholars, which I will later narrate to or refer to, makes mention of that. And so we look at different theories so that whenever we talk about tribalism, we do not only talk about it in the understanding as if this is a general understanding in different avenues of engagement or dialogues, but we talk of it with a clear conscience that there are possibilities that whenever we talk about the tribalistic tendencies and attitudes, we are actually referring to what we were given to by the colonial and the empirical powers, the identity that was given to African people. And perhaps we can hear what other scholars are saying. So the influence of colonial powers, with special reference to the 1652 and the 1800 period, one cannot talk about tribalism, the existing borders within the African continent, without making mention of the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, wherein that conference, its primary purpose was to decide utterly the sole destination of the African continent, the fate of the African people, how they will relate to each other, how they will associate with each other, and how they will begin to see themselves. So African partition was the key concept in seeking to incorporate Africa in what was then called the Commercial Republic of the world. And really the focus was on three major dimensions, and that is the political power, control, indigenization, and economic monopoly over Africa were at the heart of that conference. And so the Berlin Conference cannot be disintegrated whenever we talk about tribalism, or whenever we talk or engage on the issue of tribalism, we begin to divorce utterly the colonial influence on who African people see themselves now and how they understand what we call their ontological existence, their being, their self-expression, their cultural identity, their anthropological existential being. How do they see themselves as people of God? And these three areas that I've mentioned, the political power, the control, and indigenization, have caused huge damage on who we understand ourselves to be. Now, one of our African scholars, South African scholars, by the way, by the name of Achima Feje, writes and he says the problem of Africa is not actually empirically diversified behavior, but it is a matter of ideology. And Achima Feje brings us to the point and he says this ideology is the ideology of tribalism, wherein the European colonialism, like any epoch, brought with it certain ways of reconstructing the African reality. It regarded African society as particularly tribal. So he's making a point that whenever we refer ourselves with our tribal identities, let us be conscious that this was a concept of tribe that was given to us by the colonial powers. And he makes a very strong argument that we have to look at and read our history with a subjective reality perspective. That everything here that we are reading about as African people, as South Africans, as different tribes, as different ethnic groups, we have been greatly influenced by the colonial powers. So he further makes a point and he says, in South Africa, the indigenous population has no word for tribe, only for a nation. So in other words, singabantu besizwe resechaba. We saw ourselves pre-colonial time as sechaba. And he further says, we can even use clan or lineage, wherein people were traditionally identified by territory. Whose chief land do you come from? A typical question of people who did not see themselves and say, which tribe do you come from, but which chief do you come from? Which land do you come from? So the geographical borders that we are faced with as African people gave rise to what we call the social identity of each of the 48 colonial administrations, political identity and economic and cultural and religious identity. So scholars generally have a sense of saying the way we relate to each other today, whether it is because of the tribal prejudices, the biasness, the exclusionary forms, all of these were orchestrated through different colonial epochs that we have been part of and have formed part of the history. So when we talk about tribalism moving forward, what are we talking about? Because it is important that we put these things into perspective so that we don't just throw tribalism anywhere else the way we feel like we can do. So tribalism is defined as the attitude and the practice of harboring such a strong feeling of loyalty or bonds to one's tribe that one excludes or even demonizes other tribes that do not belong to that particular group. So ethnicity refers to cultural factors, including nationality, regional culture, ancestry, and language. Or it can be referred to as an individual's or a group's social identification. So both terms are used in most cases interchangeably. But in trying to make sense of tribalism and ethnicity and how do we use them in different contexts depending on what is the incident at that particular time, ethnocentrism is defined as well as the belief in the inherent superiority of one's own ethnic group or culture, a tendency to view alien groups or cultures from the perspective of one's own belief in the intrinsic superiority of the nation, culture, or group to which one belongs, often accompanied by feelings of dislike for other groups. So whenever we say a person is a tribalistic person, or the person perpetuates tribalism, we need to be aware that we are actually saying that person expresses a deep form of hatred, a deep form of prejudice against other group, against other cultural groups. And in most cases, I take side with the group that I belong to, which I have come to be familiar with that particular cultural group. And so ordinarily people will align themselves, they will form a part of allegiance in which they see themselves to be part of a particular cultural group, and I will side with that cultural group. I will even die for that cultural group because that's part of who I am as an individual. But we should not forget that all these things, as they have been orchestrated by the colonial powers, they have had a particular influence in our society. And I would like to make reference to what we call the Homeland Act, the influence of the Homeland Act in entrenching ethnicity and tribalism. So during the apartheid time, from the late 1950s, the South African government attempted to divide South Africa into a number of separate states called homelands for blacks, only for black people. Under the homeland system, each state was supposed to develop into a separate nation for a different ethnic or tribal group. According to the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959, Black people were classified into ethnic groups of whom a so-called homeland would be established. So you'd remember the Transkei, the Bophuthatswana, the Ciskei, the Zululand, and all these homeland groups. People were grouped in accordance with language, culture, customs, and practices. You, the Tswana people, will be on a particular group. You, the Xhosa people, will be on a particular group. You, the Zulu speaking, will be on a particular group. You, the Venda speaking people, will be on a particular group, and you will all be governed differently. Now, the issue that we need to interrogate is how far did the Homeland Act entrench tribalism? So if you would think back, as a person who grew up under the Bophuthatswana government, I knew that as a Tswana speaking person, in our area, there's only Tswana speaking people. And if you get other cultural groups, it will be the Sotho speaking people. And at the later stage, we started seeing some of the Xhosa speaking people moving into the area. But how are people treated? They are treated as people who are not supposed to be there. They are treated as strangers. They are treated as people who do not belong to the community because you are not part of us. So that was the main intention of the homeland. It was to divide Black people. It was to divide Black people in accordance with their tribe, in accordance with their ethnic groups, and to entrench furthermore the deep level of separation among those that are part of this country. And so whenever we talk about tribalism, we do not only talk about what is happening in the church, but we look at where do we come from in terms of history. And all of that I've mentioned has had an influence. And we learn from other African countries what has been the consequences of communities that has perpetuated tribalism or ethnicism. And let me look at only 2 African countries. So if you know history and follow history, you would remember that post-election of the Kenya in 2007, just after that, we experienced serious ethnic violence as the African continent, whereby it was believed by various anthropologists and scholars who did research on this particular concept around the ethnic violence of 2007 post-election in Kenya, that the colonial ideology of power and control played a significant role in leading what the 2 groups were struggling with, the Kikuyu group of Kenya to exercise power and control over the Luo group of Kenya. And so the 2 groups were fighting, but it was about power and control. And it takes us back to what actually the Berlin Conference was all about, to ensure that ultimately there's going to be constant fight among the African people on issues of power, on issues of economy, on politics, and on control. As a result of the 2007 ethnic violence in Kenya, a total number of 1,133 people died. 3,561 people suffered serious injuries. So there were many souls. These are not just numbers. These are souls. These are families that lost their loved ones. These are people who left this Mother Earth simply because of a tribal and ethnic difference, which was greatly influenced by power and control, superiority that we spoke about. We cannot forget the Rwandan ethnic tension between the Hutu and the Tutsis that resulted into a genocide, whereby more than 300,000 Tutsis fled the country. And then more than 800,000 people died. And so these are realities of life that we are faced with. Whenever people participate and engage on perpetuation of the ethnic and the tribal challenges, we realize that ultimately people they are not mindful of what this can lead to. Lives can be lost. And we've got many other stories that we can share in various parts of the country. We've got stories that we can share even in our own country as well, that has led to people losing their lives because of ethnic and tribal tensions. So what can we do to transform the misconceptions? How do we deal with what we learned either through Homeland Act, where we were grouped together as a particular tribe, and we eventually realized that there is no other person who can come here beside one of us. There is no other person who can form part of us if they do not embody the same cultural identity. And that has led to exclusionary forms of existence based on tribal superiority, wherein people have come to a point of saying, sifuna only abantwana bomgquba, re batla bana ba legae. So bana ba legae, we measure them through one language, cultural practices, and sometimes people even go to a point of appearance. How does one appear, you know? And we have developed over time some prejudices against each other, against tribal groups, against ethnic groups. And some of those that I can immediately recall as I grew up, I remember in my area, they used to say, you know what, oske wanyala mosadi wa mXhosa, or oske wanyala mosadi wa mZulu. And then you begin to wonder, but why? And you know the prejudices. People would say, hey, ba lawyer, hey, badira in. And these are offensive, insulting statements that you continue to hear about them even today. I would not be surprised that there are other young people who are saying, I was in the chat nomXhosa, or kanye I was in the chat nomTswana, because abaTswana banje, or kanye amaZulu anje, you know, or kanye amaVenda anje, or kanye abeSotho banje, and the list goes on, or amaSwati anje. There are these prejudices that we grew up with, and that those prejudices took place in a very formative stages. And they are taking place in informal discussions, not formal places. You know, in informal discussions where people are seated generally and they will be talking to each other and would start talking in a prejudiced manner about other tribal groups. I saw in the chat nomXhosa because amaXhosa anje. Hi, amadoda amaXhosa anje. Amadoda beTswana banje. You know, banna bamaZulu baso. Ngase nyalane le bone or ngase utlwane le bone. And we've got all these other marginalizing statements that we often use. Point of isolation or excluding other people, being judgmental to others. These are things that need to be transformed. And I strongly believe that we need to transform the language in informal spaces, because informal spaces are dangerous. They are dangerous than formal spaces. People can pretend in the church. They will never tell the truth, how they think and how they perceive other cultural groups. They can only safely talk about that in their own informal spaces, when they meet in their own clique or their own group, as for example, as Tswana people, that they will feel safe to talk more about other Nguni speaking cultural groups. The same happens on the other side of other cultural groups. They would feel safe and say, you know, Abatswana Banji, you know, and those things happens in informal discussions. And informal discussions are formational in nature. People internalize those discussions. They begin to see each other in the lenses or the eyes of the discussions that they had informally. And they make judgments on such things. And so destructive and derogatory statements like Tina Sitweli country, you know, we as the Xhosa nation, I see Sitweli country, 100% Zulu campaign, you know, it's our yeye to Tina Nguni speaking people. The Tswanas would be saying, Matebela rata go laola. These are statements that continues to perpetuate what we see in the society today, as we term it tribalism. These are statements that continues to dehumanize people of God out there. These are statements that continues to insinuate the undertones of violence. These are statements that continues to insinuate superiority cultures. These are statements that continues to insinuate that other cultural groups are non-performing or even non-existent, actually, to a point that we feel that Tina Sitweli country. You know, people make these statements jokingly, but I do not for a moment think that they understand the gravity and the seriousness of what such statements do to the society. That you make other people, you exclude them, you make them feel inferior, you make them feel incompetent, you make them feel as if they are non-existent by making statements of this nature. So we need to come to a point of saying, what are the things that we have learned as different cultural groups that needs to be transformed? What are my misconceptions about other tribal groups? What are my perceptions that are destructive about other tribal groups? How can I transform my language? How do I stop speaking in a very prejudiced, marginalizing, exclusionary manner to other tribal groups? I'm looking at time and I can see that I'm running out of time. So let me try and wrap up. So when it comes to inclusive worship, the first thing that I am proposing is that language is a powerful factor. Language can either tell us who is powerful and who is weak. Language can tell us who are the oppressed and who are the liberated. Language can tell us who are the influential and who are the non-influential. And you can ask yourself many questions around the use of language in various worshiping spaces, in the connection and in connectional events. What is the dominating vernacular language that we use in the connection, and why? You know, why there must be a particular dominating language when we belong to to one family of God? Why should we not be in a position of beginning to be intentional about using the language, like the former people that I've quoted, to use the language as one of the tools to create inclusion, that people feel accepted in the society and in the Church of Christ. So whenever we go to connectional events, there's always an issue about language. And we need to transcend that as people of God, and find ways in which we empower each other, but also deal with attitudes towards languages. That whenever there's a particular language that is being sung, people develop attitude. When there's another language that has been sung, people develop attitude. We need to understand the power of language, and that language is not a matter of expressing my cultural identity, but it can also be used as an exclusionary form. Again, when it comes to leadership, discernment processes towards elections in many parts of our connection are greatly influenced by tribalism and ethnicity. Leadership imbalances in the system based on which tribal group do you come from, which ethnic group do you come from. I think we need to come to a point of choosing leaders for the church, not based on any other thing or ethnic or tribal group, but based on abilities, giftings, and leadership qualities and passion to serve. If we do this, we are moving towards being an inclusive community of God, where people belong, where people are affirmed, where people are embraced. In conclusion, though we cannot think alike, may we not love alike. May we not be of one heart. Though we are not of one opinion, without all doubt we may. Herein all the children of God may unite, notwithstanding these smaller differences. I believe we are a community of love. We can love. We can denounce tribalism. I do not foresee, or rather, I do not see how we, as the people of God, as Methodists, even during this current ongoing protest out there, that they've got some tribalistic nuances and rhetorics in them, that we can participate in such. We need to denounce such. We need to call them out. We need to say, no, it cannot be. We are one nation. Let us not continue to perpetuate the colonial project. Let us not continue to perpetuate the internal oppression. Let us not continue to perpetuate being and living within the dungeons of colonialism. Let us encourage inclusivity and acceptance. Let us educate and empower people to be comfortable with each other. And I conclude by saying, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None other but yourself can do it. Have no fear for atomic energy, because none of them can stop the time. We are a community of freedom. We are the community of love. We are the community of justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mogoti. I think that was very informative, and it's a very necessary topic to have. I have a few questions and comments. People have been sharing on the platform. The first question that I have, which you touched on presentation, Yahao, is with regards to tribalism. Did we as Black people inherit tribalism from colonization? Is it safe to say that? Is it because we were oppressed so much because of the color of our skin, and we were then deemed to be inferior, that we find some sort of comfort and superiority in oppressing other people based on their cultures or their languages, is it safe to then say that we inherited tribalism from colonization?
Well, I can safely say it is safe to say that, because research has been done, scholars have engaged, particularly from an African perspective, to identify how was life like pre-colonialism. How did we live? Did we live as a nation, or did we live in accordance with tribes and the borders that were set for us? And if we read history in the light of Achima Feje's interpretation, and we are subjective to it, we can safely say, indeed, we did not refer to tribes. We're a nation. So when you talk of a nation, I do not see you from a particular tribal group, but I see you as one of me. You and I are one person. We are a nation. Resechaba. We are a hopeful Sizwe, in the language of Alan Busak.
I would like to bring it into the church, into our everyday worship and fellowship. I have a comment on Facebook from Amawele as a Chesterfield Vilagazi. Ati vele tribalism inkulu la. Nabafundisi bethu abafuna ukusebenzisa amaculo esiZulu eKZN. They even befunda imithandazo kwiculo basho amaculo esiXhosa only. Bese thina besizulu sibukela bona bethandaza. Mawucula ngesizulu athi amakholwa uyawaphazamisa. Which then brings me to my question, Yahore. Since tribalism hinders with our spirituality, how do we as a church avoid such an act from dividing us further? Because you mentioned earlier on, Hore, when we sing in a certain language, then we don't participate as compared to when we sing in another language. How do we then get to a point where we don't allow this monster from dividing us further?
Okay. Firstly, I was intentional to include some of the work that has been done over years. And I like the comment from Facebook where the particular speaker is making reference of Abefundis, Baruti, that we are leaders, we play a critical role. So let me use a classical example. I cannot be stationed as a minister right in Ekobo, or Ekonce, in a predominantly Xhosa speaking community, and I want to speak Setswana. I mean, it is just logic. It will not make any logical sense, because I am not there to impose my cultural identity, but I am there to ensure that I advance the gospel. And in order to advance the gospel, the culture of the people is important. So I need to learn the language of that community. I must not have an attitude and say, I'm not going to sing Xhosa. I will make them sing Setswana because I've got power, I've got authority, and I will influence them to sing my language. No. That's actually robbing people their own identity. And that comment is spot on, because you question why in a 80% Zulu speaking community, you would insist that people should sing Siyakudumisa in Xhosa. It's a question of superiority. It's a question of wanting to dominate. It's a question of robbing people their cultural identity. Why right in the middle of Northwest, in a Tswana speaking community, why Batswana should be singing Siyakudumisa and not singing Riakobaka Morena? Because they need to find expression of what we call their ontological existence and cultural expression in their own comfort, in their own proverbial skin, you know? So it makes sense for me to question that and say, why do you want me to sing in isiXhosa when I am Zulu? Why can't you, as a person coming into my local context, learn my language? So again, it's an attitude of language.
Allow me to switch it, Hanyani, and say from the leadership, which is Abefundisi, and bringing down to a congregant. I am a member of the Central Methodist Circuit 901 in Johannesburg, and it is known, it's Xhosa dominant. And I remember when I first started there, started fellowshipping at the circuit, I had a lot of people ask me, how do you do it? Because the church literally consists of over 80% Xhosa speaking people, and the minority is Sotho, be it Northern Sotho, Tswana, any other language, but predominantly Xhosa. And I recall constantly being asked, well, how do you do it? And personally for me, it was because I stayed true to who I am. I didn't get there and be like, okay, I'm part of that minority, therefore I'm going to lose who I am. But how do we then handle and avoid being swallowed by your surrounding and conforming to the environment that you are currently in, and in the process losing yourself? You know, you find yourself not being able to stand in front of people and or minister in your mother tongue, because you are standing in front of people by Longhore. Majority of them are Nguni speaking people. So therefore you find yourself gradually then losing yourself. How do we then avoid getting to such a point?
Okay. You'll recognize that one of the things that tribalism does is to make other cultural groups feel inferior. So cultural superiority or tribal superiority then becomes the bone of contention. So it becomes more about power control, you know. And now I can imagine the minute you stating 80% Nguni speaking, for somebody who does not have confidence, right, to be in a public space, who will not digest or even swallow the comments that might come and say, "Hi, asukzwanga thina obosithini." You know, we didn't hear what you were saying. So if somebody does not have the courage to stand for that, for somebody you have just prayed and they said, "Ayasimzwanga, not akavanga, masipate was tandazela so that God can hear." You know, you get such things and they destroy souls, they destroy people. You know, so if somebody does not have confidence to do that, and you're mentioning majority, and I want to deal with this issue of majority, because this is where superiority comes from. You're using numbers to disadvantage others. Now, the question is this thing, the business that we are in the church, is it about the majority and the minority, or is it about us wanting to belong because we are the people of God? You know, so if my argument is, if we are the people of God, we belong together in this space, let me be comfortable in praying in Setswana, you know, embrace me, accept me, affirm me, and learn in the process. So I can say to our Zulu brothers, to our Venda, Swati brothers, to our Tswana, let us learn to be comfortable in our own languages and affirm, create a space where we can learn from each other. And by so doing, we'll break this ongoing barrier and prejudices, exclusionary forms, and marginalization that we see in church spaces.
You know, I am actually laughing how only the comments that would follow after you have prayed or ministered in your language is that you know, and now it's funny. But a few years ago, when I was in that situation, I remember being so upset to a point where I actually almost didn't continue with my journey of being robed into the Wesley Guild, because I was like, how do people live like this, you know? And I think when such things happen and when we perpetuate them, we are very nonchalant about the fact and the effect that it has on the other person, you know, because it makes you feel less of a person. And it has a long lasting effect to a point where you're like, maybe I shouldn't even be here. And you forget why God put you there. I have a comment here from Tandegam Sibi Uti. MCSA tribalism is very high, and it's so disappointing for Christians. It shows how people are not repentant, but they just use church as a social gathering. And then Sivwile Mzi says, in inverted commas, I quote, which chief or land or clan or nation do you come from? Close quote. That's why people were always referred to by their chief and their identity. And that would change based on who was their chief at the time. So it has quite a historical background into NII tribalism. It's something that definitely doesn't start now. My other question, Tatumukoti, is going forward. We have seen the effect and the impact that tribalism has in a bigger scale, where you mentioned Rwanda earlier on, you know, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Now, if we're to bring it into the church, if we don't deal with this silent killer, actually it's not so silent, but if we don't deal with tribalism, what impact would you say it would have if you were to warn someone now and say, if you don't get out of that mind state, this is where we're going? Where would you say we're going?
Okay. Let me respond on this question in a different way and say the church should not see itself as a separate entity from society. The church is not immune from the social ills that South Africa is suffering from, because members of the Methodist Church are members of the society. They are members of the nation. You know, they participate in politics, they participate in economy, they participate in humanitarian issues and dialogues that the society is struggling with at the moment. And dare I say, if we as the Methodist Church don't stand and begin to confront tribalism, God forbid, we are going to find ourselves being party to ethnic violence that has the potential to erupt in this nation. We are going to find ourselves as a nation and members of the church suffering loss of family members, because just one statement from a person can lead to ethnic violence. And I saw this Twitter statement saying, Sizoshisa Amaxhosa. You know that statement? I saw that. And you can ask questions and say, who wrote that statement? Is that person not a baptized child of God? We can assume that. Is that person not even belonging to a church for that matter? You know, how do we know that that person is not a Methodist or is not an Anglican, is not a Presbyterian? You know, how do we know that? So my point is that that question we need to look at it in a broader scale of things and say our silence and tolerance of very derogatory statements, destructive statements in the church, we are actually unconsciously perpetuating ethnic violence, subtle ethnic violence in the society. Because this person see in the church that it is tolerated. You know, we can tolerate for people to say, hi, let our Yamaxhosa, or you know, that's just statement, just that statement. A person takes that, and tomorrow we see them and say, we are going to be protecting our Zulu president. you know, and I'm throwing in that because that's where it starts. It starts in such spaces where we tolerate such statements. And tomorrow we see people protesting and say, we are protecting our Tswana president, or we are protecting our Venda president. Because in the church, we have aligned ourselves in these tribal groups and say, we're going to protect our Motswana Muruti. We're going to protect our Xhosa Muruti. And tomorrow we see other people doing it outside. So if the church continues to allow destructive statements to be said in the church, to allow perpetual exclusionary ways of being church, and that ranges from language use in the church, you know, making people feel bad about who they are in terms of their ethnic or tribal identity. You know, if we continue to allow such, unfortunately, we are going to see ourselves being part of the statistics in Africa, being part like your Rwanda, your Ghana for that matter, you know, your Kenya, because church is not immune from what is happening in other parts of the world.
That is very, very true. I've got a comment from Tabiso Mambo for Aaron. As people of different cultures, let us stop wanting to dominate others. Let us learn other languages and start to be inclusive. This problem has been left unattended for long now. It's time to change. And I echo the same sentiments because too often we laugh and we make jokes, like what you mentioned earlier. But we also have a thing where we call each other derogatory names based on the languages we speak. I know Basotho, Liling, Batswana, or Mapedi, we have this thing where we say, Xhosa speaking people, Gematot, hey, Matot ate, you know, and Libo, Matebele, yes, and Libona have a sheba. Hey, Heliba Japere, Nidia in transport, you know, and like we laugh at such things, but it's actually the root cause of tribalism as well. And we've normalized it to a point where we have become very insensitive to the impact and effects that it has. Moroma Mohapi Ore, I am just glad in the Anglican Church we have Setswana, isiZulu, Sesotho, English, etc. Prayer books. I was always concerned about the Methodist Church. Moroma, you know, the funny thing is, or the irony to this is that even in the Methodist Church, we have hymn books that are the different languages. You know, we've got Zulu, we've got English. But what always worries me, especially even in services, when we come to church, it could be a general church service or it could be an organization's church service. Whenever we go there, we have a habit of only taking maybe hymn book, yes, and your Bible. And already we are now eliminating these other languages, and we are not forthcoming to them, you know. And it's always been something that had troubled me for a long time. When you come to these services, we hardly ever come with all hymn books. It's always just one language and your Bible. We have a hand, Patrick, I will just note you just now. Let me just take one last comment and then I will hand over to Patrick. And okay, no, that's just a comment. Mandakazi asking someone on the why are you concerned about the Methodist. Patrick, you can take the stand.
Morolong, dumela ntate.
Dumela ntate. O kae gadebe?
Ke petse ntate. Modimo a mthutsa le kae ntate?
Ke teng ngwana mme, ke teng man.
Hey.
Good.
Ngosisis. Morolong, thank you very much for this presentation. Truly speaking, I debate minenye As you know, you are coming from the society where as the person who grew up a KNB district, where the preacher will carry 5 hymn books. When he will preach in Xhosa, and then there's somebody who need to interpret in Afrikaans, whereby in a black society we sing the Afrikaans hymns. Unfortunately, truly speaking, I think the main problem is the language. For instance, if you can go Mkanduli or a Dudwa, and then you 90% of your, 60% of your sermon is English, and then you'll find out these people they starting to log in, go Facebook, because they don't hear you, or you. If you are a person that you can read, you'll find out, Norman, I think up in India, in the Ambandodwa, I think we have it's an attitude towards the languages. No, in fact, it doesn't happen only to the black or the black society. It happens when umfundisi ongumlungu ozawushumayela lokishini, you'll see a tendency yehamende. I done this for a period of 16 years. The current bishop is still the superintendent, a Helderberg. When you see a Caesar, you will see that the tendency, the people are about you see. So I think I'm not sure in Dubai singayilungisa ngaluphuhlobo indoba ihamende ifunde ukwamkelana, because the only problem indoba ukwamkela lo muntu uzisiweyo, ukwamkela lo muntu ukhonza naye. Thank you, Mfundisi.
Okay, thank you. Fortunately, Ntate Saibogo comes from Rosebank, and I want to use Rosebank as one of the churches in our connection that I believe thus far has really mastered different elements of inclusivity on how they do church. I wonder, a lot of people knows that at Rosebank Methodist Church, right in Cape Town, in the center of Cape Town, close to University of Cape Town, you sing the Lord's Prayer in Sesotho fluently, Lord's Prayer in Sesotho. You ask that congregation to sing a Sesotho hymn for you. You can go to YouTube and check their videos. They sing Sesotho, and I'm talking people who come from different parts of the connection because of the university. You know, you got people who are coming from Eastern Cape, Eastern Cape, KZN. They get to Rosebank and they realize that here we're not only singing isiXhosa, we're singing Sesotho, we're singing Zulu, you know, and there is also Shona as well, because we've got Zimbabweans there. That congregation for me is a classical model that can be adopted by various churches, particularly in the cosmopolitan areas, on becoming inclusive and be intentional. They sing other languages without any attitude. You stand there as a preacher, as a Zulu-speaking preacher, you read the Bible in Zulu, you read the Bible in Shona, you will not get any unnecessary remarks. So I'm using that as a response to Ntate Saibogo and say, we need to give credit where it is due. we've got one congregation, at least I know of so far in the connection, that is mastering this point of inclusivity. And for that matter, the sermon, when you preach there, because they are saying, we want to be inclusive here, you're not going to preach in Setswana, Moruti Monoametsi. You're going to preach in English because everybody must hear you. The prayers, you will do them in different languages. Your liturgy must be reflecting different languages. It is what the church agreed on. It's a brilliant, brilliant classical example that I believe needs to be adopted in various parts of our connection to emphasize, to encourage, and to inspire inclusivity as we seek to be a united church, particularly among us as Black people. And I believe it can be done. It can be done. Thank you.
It definitely can be. Well, so this is one of those topics, as you alluded earlier on, Hore, and I was not enough for this type of topic. It's one of those topics that could go on and on and on and on. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm going to take the last comment from Umamukre Tamakwenkwe. Thank you, Mbingeleli. This is very honest, and we should constantly have this discussion. That will help prick our conscience and make us unlearn these derogatory stereotypes about other cultural groups. This is one topic we can't say is overemphasized and over-discussed. Let it be an everyday conversation. Thank you once more, Mbingeleli. Thank you very much, Moruti. We thank you for your time. We thank you for this very informative discussion. We thank you for opening our mindset and, just broadening our knowledge with this topic. I think it's one of those topics, maybe we're not aware of our actions. And I think we'll be a bit more aware of what we do going forward. So from everyone watching this and from everyone, the Wesley Guild SA admin team, would really, really like to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I am humbled. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to ask Ndate Saibokwe and then we will all and call it a day.
Mastanders. Enkosi Thixo ngale mfundiso. Enkosi Thixo ngesicaka sakho. Enkosi Thixo ngezicaka zakho. Mane Enkosi zisiphathele imfundiso ngemfundiso. Enkosi Thixo ngenceba yakho. Enkosi Thixo ngerhamente yakho. Enkosi Thixo ngesiphoso sobomi osinike sona. Siyabulela ke moyo ingcwele ngezicaka zakho. Sibulela Nkosi ngomane uzityhila kwezicaka zakho. Sibulela Nkosi ngomane uhamba nathi Thixo imiso ngemiso. Sibulela Nkosi nokusiphephisa Nkosi kule coronavirus. Nkosi simema umoya wakho ingcwele udambise kuzo zonke indawo ezinesaqhwithi Thixo namandla. Sibulela ke Nkosi uba noThixo nguwe. Xa silala Nkosi simeme ngelosi zakho zezulu zihlale kumakhaya ethu sonke kweli lizwe Thixo namandla. Sizicela ke Nkosi into sizicela egameni loThixo Uyise nasegameni loThixo Unyana nasegameni loThixo Umoya Oyingcwele. Amen.
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 Atshwaro ya morena wa rona Jesu Kriste lerato kopano le matshediso mo boitshepo di nne le rona jang ka go sena
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone that is watching this. I would like to ask that we all stay home and be safe and pray while we go through what the country is going through. And may the good Lord bless and protect each and every one of you. I would like to say good night and God bless.
You too. Thank you.